They didn't teach you this in school. The Wild West wasn't just tumbleweeds and cowboy hats. It was full of chaos, con artists, coded messages, and more rules than a Vegas blackjack table. Forget what Hollywood told you. This was a land where barbed wire could start a war, whiskey doubled as anesthesia, and people used tree sap as glue. Buckle your brain, because these 49 facts will make you question if you even knew what the Wild West really was. 1. Cowboys feared lightning storms more than anything else. While gunslingers and rattlesnakes got the cinematic spotlight, what truly sent shivers down a cowboy's spine was the sound of thunder rolling over an open prairie. With no shelter and nothing but metal spurs, belt buckles, and rifles to attract a bolt of pure wrath from the sky, being caught in a storm was like playing tag with death, barefoot. Some cowboys even removed their spurs during storms, hoping to avoid becoming human lightning rods. And let's be honest, there's nothing rugged about being flash-fried while trying to herd cattle. It's like nature's way of saying, nice hat. Shame if something zapped it. 2. The first rodeo wasn't some rowdy rootin'-tootin' entertainment show. When Pecos, Texas hosted it in 1883, it was essentially a glorified job interview with lassos. Cowboys gathered not for cheers but to flex their cattle handling skills in front of ranch owners looking to hire the best. It was part competition, part cattle call, pun intended, and very much a high-stakes show-off session. Only later did someone say, "You know what would make this better? Beer, bleachers, and betting." Thus, the rodeo evolved from a cowboy LinkedIn into the boot-stomping spectacle we know today. 3. The Wild West wasn't just a showdown between man and nature. It was also a weird petting zoo. Settlers and pioneers, apparently tired of dogs and cats, took on companions like raccoons, prairie dogs, and even bear cubs. Yes, someone thought, you know what my homestead needs? A bear. Prairie dogs were practically the West's version of hamsters, and raccoons were like furry little burglars with charm. Of course, keeping a bear cub as a pet usually ended one of two ways, either with a lot of scratches or a story that started with, "So I used to have a bear." 4. Cowboys didn't just practice lassoing on cattle. They'd rope anything that didn't move fast enough. Fences? Fair game. Tree branches? Absolutely. A friend walking by minding his business? Why not? Lassoing each other became a spontaneous sport among bored wranglers, which occasionally ended in rope burns, bruised egos, and someone yelling, "Untie me, you jackass!" It was the Wild West version of TikTok challenges. Pointless, chaotic, and always one step from disaster. But hey, if you can rope a guy sprinting away with your last can of beans, you definitely deserve that job on the ranch. 5. That wide-brimmed, dramatic cowboy hat? Yeah, it wasn't always the standard headgear. Before the late 1800s, cowboys were rocking bowler hats, flat caps, and anything else that stayed on in the wind. Picture an old-school wrangler tipping his neat little derby as he walks into a saloon. It's less John Wayne and more Wall Street meets prairie dust. The shift happened when the Stetson hat came along and basically rebranded cowboy style forever. But still, imagine the grit it took to ride a horse, herd cattle, and duel at high noon in a bowler. Now that's confidence. 6. The infamous dead man's hand, aces and eights, earned its cursed reputation thanks to Wild Bill Hickok. Legend has it, he was holding that exact combo when he was shot in the back during a poker game in Deadwood. Ever since, it's been the blackjack table's version of the Grim Reaper. Sure, it's just a pair of aces and eights, but if that's what you're dealt, maybe put your cards down and slowly back away. Or at least don't sit with your back to the door. History already proved that's a gamble you don't win. 7. Annie Oakley didn't just shoot like a pro, she redefined sharpshooting. She could split a playing card edge-on from 30 feet away using a rifle, and she did it so casually it made grown men reconsider their life choices. While the rest of the country was still figuring out how to aim, she was out here sniping matches off cigars and doing it all in a skirt. They called her Little Sure Shot, but honestly, human aimbot would have worked too. Trick shots? She invented them, decades before YouTube made them trendy. 8. Moonshine in the Wild West was the kind of drink that could blind you, cure a cold, and probably dissolve rust. Cowboys brewed their own liquor from whatever they could get their hands on. Potatoes, corn, tree bark, possibly old boots if things got desperate enough. The result? A drink so strong it could double as lamp fuel or engine degreaser. There were no flavor notes or oak-aged aromas, just pure burn. It was survival alcohol, not sipping whiskey. And if you managed to survive a sip without seeing ghosts, congratulations. You were now the life of the campfire. 9. Despite the dusty image we all have of the Wild West, many frontier towns were surprisingly cultured, at least in structure. Opera houses, theaters, and schools often popped up before proper roads were even paved. So while folks were riding horses through mud to get to town, they were doing it to catch a performance of Faust. Priorities, right? It's the kind of contradiction that makes the West so fascinating. Shootouts at noon, Shakespeare by night. Honestly, it's like building a high-end wine bar next to a gun range. Chaotic, but somehow it works. 10. Forget damsels in distress. Women of the Wild West were the original action heroes. Calamity Jane wasn't just a sharpshooter who could probably outdrink and outride most men. She also worked as a nurse during a smallpox outbreak, risking her life to treat the sick. These women weren't just tough for their time. They were just tough, period. They managed households, rode horses, fought off bandits, and still found time to throw sass like throwing knives. If modern survival shows featured them, they'd win before the intro credits even rolled. 11. Native American tribes like the Comanche didn't just ride horses. They became one with them. These warriors could leap onto moving horses, fire arrows while hanging off the side, and steer using just their knees. Think of it as the original stunt riding, without a saddle, helmet, or any regard for gravity. European settlers were so stunned by their mobility that they often mistook it for magic. The Comanche weren't just skilled riders. They defined what it meant to be horsemen. And if your survival depended on speed and precision, you better believe they trained until they could shoot a squirrel mid-gallop. Not that they did, but you get the point. 12. Cattle rustling has been painted as a hanging offense in Western lore, but in reality, it was often a game of who's got the better branding iron. In the chaotic sprawl of the frontier, cows roamed freely, and ownership was often determined by whoever got to them first. Some ranchers would quietly rebrand strays or conveniently lose count. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was survival, sometimes creative accounting with livestock. And if your neighbor's steer just happened to wander over to your side of the fence, well, maybe it wanted a change of scenery. 13. Living miles from civilization didn't mean you had to settle for a shack and a prayer. Thanks to mail-order catalogs like Sears and Montgomery Ward, settlers could order nearly anything: tools, weapons, wedding dresses, coffins, entire houses in pieces. You'd flip through the catalog, mail your money, and wait. For weeks or months, or until your beard grew a new beard. But eventually, like magic, your goods would arrive by wagon or rail. It was Amazon Prime, minus the Prime, and the internet, and the guarantee of timely delivery. Still, for many, it was a lifeline to the modern world. 14. Wild West medicine sounds like a horror show, and sometimes it was, but it also had flashes of brilliance. Some frontier doctors pulled off amputations, bullet extractions, and even C-sections with nothing but bone saws, whiskey, and brass nerves. Anesthesia was a cocktail of chloroform, ether, or strong booze, usually served in quantities large enough to knock out a buffalo. And while hygiene was, let's say, optional, many pioneers survived thanks to these gritty, inventive practitioners. Sure, the mortality rate wasn't great, but the bedside manner? Incredibly drunk and probably yelling, "Bite this stick." 15. Everyone thinks the West was all about gold, but that shiny metal wasn't the only prize. Silver rushes were just as intense. Tombstone, Nevada's whole origin story, was basically one giant shiny rock. Copper became a massive industry, especially in Arizona, powering telegraphs, railways, and eventually, electricity. Even salt was a big deal. Yes, salt. It preserved meat, tanned hides, and occasionally started fights that made bar brawls look like ballet. So while the gold fever hogged the headlines, the real fortune was often found in whatever the ground was willing to cough up. 16. The Buffalo Soldiers weren't just warriors, they were legends in uniform. These African-American regiments formed after the Civil War, built forts, guarded settlers, battled outlaws, and fought in some of the toughest terrain imaginable. The nickname Buffalo Soldiers was given by native tribes, possibly out of respect, possibly because their hair reminded them of buffalo manes. Either way, it stuck. They fought prejudice, poverty, and Apache ambushes, and did it all in hand-me-down gear with barely any recognition. But make no mistake, the West would have been a whole lot wilder without them holding the line. 17. Picture a landscape so thick with buffalo that the ground moved. That's how settlers described the great herds. Millions of beasts, stretching across the plains like a living, breathing carpet of muscle and fur. And then, the slaughter began. Driven by market demand, military strategy, and sheer greed, buffalo were hunted to near extinction in just a few decades. From over 30 million to barely a few hundred by the 1880s, it was ecological destruction at industrial speed. The buffalo wasn't just a symbol of the plains. It was the plains. And we almost erased it with rifles and railroads. 18. Billy the Kid was less of a bloodthirsty outlaw and more of a misunderstood teen with a gun, and a lot of bad luck. The legend claims he killed 21 men, one for each year of his short life, but historical records suggest a much lower number, and many of those were in self-defense or during shootouts he didn't start. He was a runaway, a ranch hand, a folk hero, and a fugitive. Some saw him as a vigilante, others as a menace. The truth? He was probably just trying to survive in a world where being quick on the draw wasn't a skill. It was a necessity. 19. Stagecoach robberies might look like they happened every other Tuesday in old Western movies, but in reality, fewer than 10% of Wells Fargo shipments ever got hit. Turns out, robbing a heavily guarded bumpy box on wheels in open country was harder than it looked. Most bandits who tried ended up with a bullet, a prison sentence, or a really bad getaway story. But every so often, someone would hit the jackpot: a sack of gold dust, a payroll chest, or a mailbag with untold secrets. For those lucky few, it was a retirement plan. For the rest, just another lesson in bad decisions and poor aim. 20. Horses get all the glory, but cowboys often preferred mules. And for good reason. Mules were tougher, more sure-footed, and way less dramatic than horses. They didn't spook at shadows or throw tantrums when the trail got rough. Plus, they ate less, carried more, and didn't require constant ego-stroking. If you had to haul gear up a cliff, cross a desert, or survive a stampede of squirrels, the mule was your ride. Sure, they weren't as majestic, but in the West, practicality beat beauty every time. Just don't try to race one. Or insult it. They hold grudges. 21. Cowboys didn't exactly have Spotify, so a harmonica was their version of a portable playlist. Light, durable, and easy to stash in a saddlebag, harmonicas were the go-to entertainment during long nights on the trail. Picture this. A group of dusty cowboys circled around a fire, one of them playing a slow tune while the rest silently reflect or pretend they're not crying into their beans. It wasn't just about music, it was about sanity. After driving cattle for days, even a slightly off-key rendition of Home on the Range was better than another night of coyotes howling and stomachs growling. 22. Not all of the Wild West was scorched earth and sunstroke. Head north and you'd find yourself in an entirely different world. Oregon and Washington were bursting with green hills, thick forests, and rainfall that could humble a hurricane. Towering redwoods, moss-covered trails, and fog that made everything feel like the set of a gothic cowboy mystery. While the movies gave us deserts and tumbleweeds, the real West offered environments where you could chop wood, hunt elk, and still end up muddy instead of dusty. It's the version of the West where flannel made sense, and so did waterproof boots. 23. The Wild West wasn't just wild, it was weird. Among the ghost towns and gold rushes, locals whispered about supernatural sightings like massive flying thunderbirds and eerie lights that flickered over the plains without explanation. Some claimed the lights were spirits, others thought they were UFOs. Either way, it added a whole new level of paranoia to Night Watch. You're already worried about bandits, and now there's a glowing orb floating near your cattle? Great. The frontier might have lacked scientific understanding, but it had no shortage of spooky campfire material. X-Files, meet tumbleweeds. 24. Think prisons in the Wild West were like Fort Knox? Not quite. Some jails were little more than a locked room in the back of a saloon, or, in some cases, just a log cabin with a strong door and a weak sense of justice. Escapes were common. Some outlaws sawed their way out with hidden tools, dug tunnels using soup cans, or simply bribed the board guard with booze and a wink. One guy even faked illness, got taken to the doctor, and then vanished like a magician. Security was more of a suggestion than a system. 25. Brothels in boomtowns weren't just sweaty backrooms behind swinging saloon doors. Some were borderline five-star establishments, complete with chandeliers, velvet drapes, musicians on retainer, and wine lists that could rival Napa Valley. These were places where men paid for more than just company. They paid for an illusion of class, comfort, and status. A few even had imported chefs. You could walk in smelling like cattle and walk out full of filet mignon and regret. It was a business like any other, except the uniforms were a little shinier and the gossip far juicier. 26. Cowboy fashion wasn't about looking good. It was survival gear masquerading as style. Those dramatic leather chaps? They were leg armor against thorny brush and cacti. The wide-brimmed hat? A personal shade system, rain catcher, and occasionally a makeshift water bowl. Pointed boots? Perfect for slipping into stirrups fast, especially when your horse decided it was time to reenact a rodeo. Basically, if it looked cool, it was probably functional first. Except for that one guy who wore snakeskin everything. He was just showing off. 27. You might not expect the Wild West to be the birthplace of designer eyewear, but here we are. Gold and silver miners had to protect their eyes from the brutal glare bouncing off rock and metal surfaces, so they started using early versions of tinted lenses. These primitive sunglasses weren't for fashion. They were survival gear for your retinas. Picture a sunburn, but inside your eyeballs. Some lenses were green, others smoked, and some made you look like a steampunk prospector before that was a thing. The West, where the sun didn't set, it blinded. 28. Yes, cowboys drank. A lot. But even the toughest outlaw needed a caffeine hit between fistfights. Most saloons offered coffee and tea alongside whiskey and beer, sometimes in the same cup, depending on how your day was going. And despite the Hollywood image of non-stop bar brawls, most cowboys just wanted to drink in peace and maybe flirt awkwardly with the piano player. But get a few bad tempers, too much rot-gut whiskey, and suddenly someone's playing harmonica with their teeth on the floor? Still, nothing sobers you up like hot coffee and a broken nose. 29. Personal hygiene in the Wild West wasn't exactly celebrated. Bathing was a luxury, not a habit, and bathhouses made sure you paid for every bubble. Towns issued bath tokens that allowed you to clean yourself once a week, assuming you could wait in line and didn't mind sharing murky water with half the population. Want a second bath? That'll cost extra. Want hot water? Prepare to barter your boots. Honestly, a cowboy's smell probably entered the saloon 5 minutes before he did, and nobody was surprised. 30. Barbed wire might have been the most hated invention west of the Mississippi. While ranchers saw it as the end of cattle theft, cowboys and open-range herders saw it as the end of freedom. So they took matters into their own hands, or more accurately, wire cutters. These self-declared fence cutters snuck out at night and chopped fences like vigilantes of the prairie. It was sabotage, protest, and maybe a bit of petty revenge all rolled into one. And it sparked the so-called fence-cutting wars, which sounds hilarious until you realize it involved shootouts over fencing. Welcome to the West, where even wire could start a war. 31. Tobacco was the cowboys' Swiss Army knife. Sure, they chewed it, smoked it, and spit it with impressive accuracy, but they also slapped it on cuts, burns, and bug bites like it was some kind of miracle balm. Got a saddle sore? Rub some tobacco on it. Mosquito bite? Tobacco. Snake bite? Okay, maybe not, but someone probably tried. It wasn't remotely hygienic or medically sound, but in the absence of pharmacies and Band-Aids, you worked with what you had. And what they had was a pouch of chewing tobacco and the unshakable belief that spit was medicinal. 32. The Wild West might have had saloon shootouts and outlaws, but towns like Dodge City weren't lawless chaos. They were surprisingly strict. Gun control wasn't just a suggestion, it was enforced. Visitors had to check their weapons with the sheriff, like a coat at a fancy restaurant. No firearms in town limits, period. So next time someone says, back in the Wild West everyone carried guns, feel free to remind them that Dodge City had tighter gun laws than some modern cities. And yes, you probably also had to tie up your horse, check your revolver, and maybe pay a nickel to use the outhouse. Rules were rules. 33. Some cattle ranches in the West were so massive, they had their own zip codes before zip codes existed. We're talking tens of thousands of acres. So large that ranch hands could spend days just riding the perimeter. One ranch in Texas reportedly spanned over 3 million acres. That's not a ranch, that's a kingdom with cows. These operations ran like well-oiled machines with bunkhouses, chuck wagons, branding stations, and sometimes even their own rail lines. The bosses weren't cowboys, they were cattle barons. And their herds? Enough beef to supply the apocalypse. 34. The romanticized Wild West era lasted for about 30 intense, dusty, and often over-exaggerated years, from just after the Civil War to the early 1890s. That's shorter than the average mortgage. Yet somehow, it gave us more legends than 1,000 years of medieval Europe. Cowboys, outlaws, gold rushes, sheriffs, ghost towns, packed into one explosive generation. It's a testament to just how chaotic, cinematic, and myth-making the period was. The actual timeline? Brief. The impact on pop culture? Eternal. Hollywood's been milking those 30 years for over a century. And honestly, who can blame them? 35. Joaquin Murrieta was the kind of outlaw who made legends nervous. To some, he was a ruthless bandit. To others, he was the Mexican Robin Hood, robbing corrupt landowners and giving back to poor Mexican families dispossessed by U.S. expansion. Whether he was a criminal or a folk hero depends on which side of the border you're standing on. He was eventually hunted down, decapitated, and his head put on public display, because subtlety wasn't exactly a strong suit back then. But his story lived on, inspiring books, ballads, and even Zorro. Because nothing screams legend like revenge, justice, and a flair for the dramatic. 36. Behind the dust and denim, cowboys faced a quiet enemy: loneliness. Months spent riding the open range meant isolation, brutal weather, and conversations mostly held with horses. Depression was common, though no one called it that. They just said a man was blue or gone quiet. Add in injuries, poor diet, and the occasional rattlesnake, and the cowboy life was as mentally exhausting as it was physically brutal. Stoicism was expected, therapy was non-existent, and your only outlet was maybe a harmonica or a night at the saloon. Tough? Sure. But even the toughest cracked sometimes. 37. Contrary to the Hollywood cliché, bank robberies weren't an everyday event. In fact, most frontier banks weren't worth robbing. Small towns barely had cash on hand, and some didn't even have safes. You'd break in expecting a fortune and walk out with $3.5 and a jar of pickles. That's not outlaw glory, that's a disappointing lunch. The big-name heists? Rare. Most criminals aimed for trains or stagecoaches where payroll shipments actually traveled. So if you ever see a movie where every bank is stuffed with gold bricks, just know that's about as real as a tumbleweed named Carl running for mayor. 38. The first train robbery in the U.S. didn't happen in the Wild West. It happened in Indiana in 1866. Yep, cornfields, not cacti. But once the idea took hold, outlaws in the West jumped on board, literally. Trains became moving treasure chests, hauling cash, gold, and mail across desolate landscapes with little protection. Cue masked men, dynamite, and dramatic horseback chases. Train heists became the outlaw equivalent of a business model. Risky, high reward, and occasionally requiring a guy named One-Eyed Pete. It was like Ocean's 11, but with more dust and fewer dental plans. 39. Bronco Buster wasn't just a cool nickname, it was a job description for adrenaline junkies with a death wish. These cowboys specialized in taming wild, unbroken horses. The process? Get on, hold on, and pray the horse doesn't launch you into orbit. Broken ribs, shattered teeth, and concussions were all part of the deal. But if you managed to stay on, you earned serious respect, and maybe a few silver dollars. If not, well, you got to fly, without wings. Rodeo stars of their day, Bronco Busters, were the evil Knievels of the prairie. And no, there were no helmets. 40. Saloon gambling was less about luck and more about who could cheat without getting caught. Players stashed cards in sleeves, boots, and up their hats. But if you got caught slipping an ace where it didn't belong, you wouldn't just lose your chips, you might lose your heartbeat. Many towns had a boot hill cemetery, so named because that's where men were buried with their boots still on, usually after dying with a card up their sleeve and a bullet in their chest. The lesson? If you're gonna bluff, make sure you're also fast on the draw. 41. Jesse James might have been the most polite, cold-blooded outlaw in history. While he robbed banks and trains with a six-shooter in hand and a bounty on his head, at home he was just Dad. In between heists, Jesse played the role of a mild-mannered farmer, living with his wife Zerelda and their kids like he was auditioning for a Norman Rockwell painting, minus the whole public enemy #1 thing. It's the kind of double life that would make even Batman raise an eyebrow. One day you're gunning down Pinkertons, the next you're harvesting corn and asking the kids how school went. 42. Forget soft beds and memory foam. On the trail, cowboys had two options: saddle or dirt. Most picked the saddle, not because it was comfortable, but because it was slightly less soul-crushing than a rock. After wrangling cattle for 18 hours, even a leather seat with metal bits poking your ribs started to feel like a feather mattress. Cowboys would roll up in their blankets, use their saddle as a pillow, and drift off to the soothing lullaby of snoring horses and farting cows. It was luxury, frontier style, complete with bonus back pain. 43. The Colt Peacemaker wasn't just a gun, it was the iPhone of the West. Everyone had one. Cowboys, lawmen, outlaws, and anyone else who wanted to be taken seriously. Chambered in .45 caliber and built like a tank, it earned the nickname the gun that won the West because it rarely jammed, hit hard, and looked damn good in a quick draw. If you were caught without one, people assumed you were either broke, British, or about to die. Let's just say it settled more disputes than any town hall meeting ever could. 44. Think fake news is a modern problem? Meet the penny dreadful. These dirt-cheap novels were the 1800s version of clickbait, crammed with exaggerated tales of gunslingers, monsters, damsels, and enough bloodshed to make Tarantino blush. They transformed real-life cowhands into superhuman vigilantes and gave outlaws like Billy the Kid comic book level fame. Never mind that half of it was nonsense. People devoured them like frontier popcorn. It was sensationalism, drama, and bad grammar all rolled into one dime store disaster piece. And guess what? It worked. These stories helped build the myth of the Wild West that Hollywood's still cashing in on. 45. Cattle drives weren't weekend road trips. They were grueling marathons on horseback. Herds of thousands were pushed up to 15 miles a day across blistering plains and rocky trails. Cowboys rode in shifts, rotating through 18-hour days to make sure the herd didn't scatter, stampede, or get stolen. Sleep was minimal. Meals were cold beans if you were lucky, and your only bathroom was, well, wherever you stopped. Add in river crossings, rattlesnakes, and storms, and you've got a cowboy's version of a corporate team-building retreat, just with fewer PowerPoints and way more manure. 46. Cowboys didn't have duct tape, but they had sap, tar, and grit. Saddle coming apart? Slap some tree sap on it. Boot sole peeling off? Smear on some tar and keep riding. It was DIY frontier style, messy, sticky, and highly flammable. But it worked. In a world where the nearest blacksmith might be 50 miles away, being your own leather repairman wasn't a choice, it was survival. You weren't a cowboy if you didn't smell at least 30% like pine and desperation. And hey, if the glue didn't hold, that's what rope was for. 47. Outlaw gangs weren't just chaotic desperados. They had systems. Some used symbols carved into trees or rocks to mark safe hideouts, stashes, or warnings about approaching lawmen. Think of it as the Wild West's version of a secret group chat. Only instead of texting "cops ahead," They scratched a skull into a fence post or left a certain number of stones by a trail. If you didn't know the code, you were lost. If you did, you knew where the whiskey and stolen payroll were buried. Telegrams were for suckers. Real bandits had runes. 48. Cowtowns like Abilene and Dodge City didn't exist just because someone liked the sound of gunfire. They were built around railroads. As cattle drives moved herds north, these towns popped up at rail junctions, transforming into livestock meccas overnight. With rail cars ready to haul beef to the East Coast, business boomed. So did trouble. Cowhands flooded in with pockets full of pay, and saloons, brothels, and poker tables followed. For a few weeks, it was all whiskey, dust, and noise, until the herd was gone, the money spent, and the cowboys rode off to the next boomtown. 49. Even in the roughest, rowdiest towns, someone always managed to print a newspaper. These frontier papers were part journalism, part gossip column, part wanted poster roundup. You'd get your local politics, saloon brawls, Sunday sermons, and news like Mrs. Ethel caught her husband dancing with the seamstress. Again, they were printed on old presses, smudged with ink, and probably edited by someone who also doubled as the barber. But they kept people informed and entertained. Because when your town had 3 buildings and one of them was a jail, reading about a chicken theft felt like Pulitzer material. So which of these blew your spurs off or pissed you off? Go on, fight it out in the comments. Was Jesse James a legend or just a glorified thief with a PR team? And before you scroll away like a bandit dodging the law, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories that'll make your history teacher weep and your uncle from Texas argue with the screen.